and welcome back to Literally Literary. If this is your first time joining us, be sure to check out our previous episodes. This episode, we will continue our discussion on We Cast a Shadow by Maurice Carlos Ruffin. Last episode, we continued the discussion focusing on Part 1. This episode, we will be focusing on Part 2 of the novel.
Well, hello everyone. It's Sunday, May 24th, and Memorial Day weekend here in the United States. And we're once again remote podcasting in El Paso, Texas. Hope everyone also is, those of you who are Muslim, having a good end to Ramadan. This is a part of the book where just a lot of things happen. So we're going to try to get through the most meaty parts of it. And we hope that you all have had a chance to pick it up. But if not, we'll give you all a clear taste of what to expect in Maurice's debut novel here, We Cast a Shadow. And so, where we had left off from part 1, we had mentioned that our narrator, unnamed protagonist, had gotten promoted from his firm in what they called elevation night thereafter, which we saw as the hazing, really. From the beginning of part 2, I had just a tiny passage in where he goes and sees who's his mama. And on 73, there's this passage that says, Mama opened a beer and poured some into the wet ingredients. Boy, Uncle Tom existed way before Harriet Beecher What's-Her-Face wrote that novel. You ain't done nothing new. She poured more beer, then stopped. Don't mind me none, leaning toward Penny for effect. He's always been stubborn. And so this is a reference to what our narrator has decided to do. But what I found really interesting about this one is not just, of course, the reference here to Uncle Tommy, but also just how his own mom, really sees through him and sees that he's kind of selling out. And it kind of brought to mind, other works that we read where other characters have been seen as selling out. Whether it's the detective in The Black Klansman selling out the Black community by becoming a cop, or what's her name? The protagonist of The Hate You Give, selling out. Sorry, yes, thank you. Selling out her community, right, by moving or by being more in touch with the white neighborhood and the white school and so forth, the affluent community. So it kind of brought that to mind. And I think, it's kind of interesting how our narrator so far, other than Octavia and co-workers, seems to be on an island. So I just found that really interesting. I don't know what you guys thought, what you thought about it, Vanessa.
I didn't make that connection right away, but now that you really pointed it out and made those connections between Black Klansman and The Hate You Give, it makes a lot of sense. I had a passage later on that I also related to both of those.
Yeah, go for
interesting.
It.
Oh, well, it's at the end of the section, okay. So we can just keep going.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so this is, the first time we've kind of had a good look at his mom. And, we also get a good sense of what kind of person our narrator is, because he also doesn't, think much of protesters, right? And, so they have a big argument there about how he doesn't want Nigel to become a troublemaker, he calls him. And he's like, well, what are they going to fight for on 74? He's like, higher wages, banking reform. And so I kind of see that as foreshadowing Nigel, because Nigel, we've talked about, is kind of between a rock and a hard place, right? Because Penny is his mom is pushing him one way direction, and then his dad is pushing him the opposite direction. Um, so this is an important scene because of that, because we see the way that his father is, and in turn, we end up judging his father instead of Nigel. Um, but so this is still in the 70s, and I think later on, Vanessa, you said you had one in the 80s.
Well, I have one on 75, and it's just
okay.
a small line towards the middle of the page, I guess, where it's like a thought that our narrator has about something that he tells Nigel, and it says, "Choose your company wisely." And I think that that's really interesting, going back to what we were just talking about, and the people that the narrator surrounds himself with as well, because he's telling him, well, I guess it relates to like my mom would always tell me, you are who you surround yourself with.
Right.
So it's like that same idea of like, these people are essentially how other people see you.
Yeah. And it's in a passage where he's talking about, Supercargo, who is quote unquote his cousin. But later on, we come to know that, spoiler alert, like they're not actually related. They just, because of the way that this dystopia is set up, people who are Black are just kind of, tied together by the powers that be. But anyway, he says how like he kept away from Supercargo because, he dropped out of high school and, was imprisoned after. So it's kind of him trying to seem, superior by, not associating with his own family, or, quote unquote family. And he's doing it, I guess, because he, in some sense, wants to set that example for his son. But at the same time, I think, you make a good point that, it's something that is a good advice, that like people can judge you based on your friends. But at the same time, I mean, it's kind of ironic because Octavia and, his other coworkers, Dina, and even to some extent Armbruster, even though he doesn't have as much an influence, and seem to not have as good a reputation because of the way that we see that like they're just using him, right? And he doesn't really. I mean, maybe he does see that, but he doesn't really come to terms with that. They don't exactly have his best interest in mind.
Right.
So yeah, this is towards the beginning, and on 77, so a couple of pages after, we get some more background into Supercargo, and we find out that the bottom of that page that he had been stopped by police, taken into custody, charged here now again for vagrancy, or these what seems to be just made up ways of just putting Black people in jail, pretty much is the way I see it. And he even admits they weren't his fault, but he says, but fault wasn't the question. I couldn't help but feel that every time he left my sight, the next thing I would hear about him was that he was profiled, chased, arrested, shot, killed, or any combination of the above. Still, I put a lot of the trouble on his appearance. He often dressed well, but his various work uniforms, from being Black, put him in the same visual class as the brothers begging for change. And so I kind of saw that as really interesting, how the Black community's identity of dreadlocks in this case is to him just the reason why he's getting in trouble, right? And I don't know what you thought of that, Vanessa, but I have my thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's so crazy that the stigma behind having braids or dreadlocks is so crazy. And then the way that it's represented in this book is just so much more extreme because it's like now reason to profile someone
Yeah,
as being a certain type of person.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's even more extreme, right? Because I'm remembering. Sorry, I'm not that good with names, but what's the name of Star's friend who gets shot?
Khalil.
Khalil, thank you. Um, he was profiled too, right? Because he was black, and he looked like, to the cop, right? He looked like he was gonna like have a gun or something on him. Um, and so even here, just the way that you look, right, is a reason to get profiled and stopped, and not just stopped, but and cited, but arrested, and put in jail.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's really sad. One of the many disappointing moments for our narrator, that he sides with the oppressor. And I think that's something that is his fatal flaw, that he's always like, no matter how bad the white um, hegemony acts, he always finds a reason for, well, it's the black community's fault because they're doing this, or, they have an afro, or whatever it is. Um, so, yeah, I just wanted to highlight that. And, it's also like, in a sense, his family, right? So, even more so that he's not willing to stand up for his own family.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And he even calls it, his hair, the dreads, he calls them unstructured and unprofessional, which is
Yeah.
really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, Richie had mentioned that it reminds him of Nigel. I mean, sorry, blanking out on the name of the alphabet. Yeah. 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 Next time, just stop me again. And, cause yeah, Nala Larson's passing, which is about what our narrator seems to be doing, that Richie had mentioned as far as connection to other works. But what is it that you were connecting this to, Black Klansman?
When he first joins the police force and they tell him that he has to shave off his afro
Mm-hmm.
or like trim it down so that it can fit
Yeah.
the hat.
Yeah. And in the film, right, that's one of the scenes that doesn't get cut.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, more ways, again, that this community is, that more ways that the police, right, and white supremacist um, forces are acting upon the black community to as a pretext, right? These are all pretexts. Like, of course, the way that you dress, the way that you make your hair, right, your hairstyle. Of course,
Mm-hmm.
there's no actual connection to whatever personality or character. Um, so yeah, after that, I had another passage on 88, but I don't know if you had one before that.
No, mine's not until like 126. So you're
Okay.
good.
Okay. Well, I just wanted for listeners to learn a little bit about the setting here, because we had already talked about this in part one in terms of where our narrator lives, but the Tico is the other highly segregated, gentrified community. I mean, not gentrified. It's very much a what they would consider to be like a shanty town, and it's referred to as a Tikoloshi housing development, aka the Tico, aka Cargo Land, aka Mondayville, aka the Big Oil Slick, the Slick, a project, a housing project. And it's described a little later on as surrounded by a tall barbed wire rimmed fence. and we had to show our IDs to get inside. He says, if we lost our IDs, they wouldn't let us out. So it's really frightening the way that this community is. Um, and its description, I don't know about you, Vanessa, but the way that the Tico is, of course, it's designed that way to keep the Black community basically. If you think about it, I mean, it's basically a prison, right? It's a prison that's
Mm-hmm.
not technically a prison, but just barbed wire and IDs. They're basically in prison and kept from whatever whatever else might actually be developed, right? Because it's a housing project, so it's like government subsidized, but as we know with a lot of projects that there's just not enough funding, and a lot of that, of course, is intentional. But it reminded me of the border because of the barbed wire fence. And here in El Paso we have the border wall, and it's one of the signs of like militarization of the border. Um, and To the narrator, he is of course Black, but he still feels like he doesn't want to be there. He's uncomfortable being there, um, and it's just one of the places where he realizes he has to go, right? Because this is where it's part of his law firm's plan to help reach out into what he calls "quote unquote" the community. Um, so he's doing this just as a kind of a photo op, basically, so that the firm can be seen as like caring about what they call disadvantaged people here on 89. But it's really superficial, right? Like they're not actually helping out in any substantive way. And he goes on describing it more, and looking really shabby, you know paint flaked off. So it's really depressing the way that this community is. And later on, we come to find that it becomes part of his own mother's community because it gets absorbed into it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, just wanted to go over for listeners the setting a little bit so that they can kind of get an idea of what Tatico is, as this kind of really hellscape for the Black community. I don't know if you had any thoughts on it, Vanessa, as far as like what struck you about it, what it reminded you of, or anything like that.
Well, I think it's so weird that it's like the Tico is growing, like it's expanding
Mm-hmm.
and absorbing like other parts of the area, like his
Yeah,
mother's.
yeah,
But it's only like a certain like type of people that are allowed in within that community also.
yeah, exactly. I mean, and this is part of, I think, what makes this a dystopian novel, dystopian setting, that um, it's very much like, 1984 kind of world, right, of hyper surveillance, where, not having an ID means that you're basically stuck in there, right? As I said, like if it was prison. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but, once he is in there, later on 96 and 97, I don't know if you remember this one, but this is Uncle Ty, whom we come to know, just like Supercargo, is not actually his uncle, but nevertheless, treats him as such. And, first he's really kind of, in a sense, surprised, but in a sense, not surprised that Uncle Ty is all very much beat up in this community when before, he was kind of like described as like someone that everyone loved, woman loved, a man's man, kind of sounds to me like a Great Gatsby of the Tico. Um, but here, because of the conditions, the living conditions, he's very disheveled and beat up, and he gained a lot of weight. And on 96 and 97, I just wanted to highlight this passage because It's very reminiscent of True Blood uh, in um, in Invisible Man. True Blood is a character who is kept by the school as a kind of example of like how the Black community is savage, because True Blood ended up having a child with his own child, so incest. Um,
Mm.
and here, it's similar in that because of the trauma that Uncle Tai experienced out of losing his own son, Jack, I think is how you pronounce it, shot by a police officer for quote unquote resisting arrest. He imagines that he actually cannibalized his own son. So it's a very disturbing passage, but I think it shows trauma that the Black community faces from these kinds of shootings at the hands of the police. And as he says there, the murder of his son had deranged him. He thinks that this really happened when it didn't. But the only way he can process that trauma is by imagining that, he ended up eating his own son and, turning him into a stew. Um, but, reminds me also of Sonny's Blues, if anyone's read that one. I don't know if you read it, Vanessa, I can't remember.
Yes.
Yeah. Um, of how Sonny and his brother's dad also was traumatized when he lost his brother or their uncle, and he ended up not recovering from that trauma from the hate crime. But yeah, so this was a very touching passage for me because of how Uncle Tai isn't getting the help that he needs, right? And he's pretty much just left to crumble in his mental health. And it's just very sad what happened, not only to his son, but to Uncle Tai himself.
Mm-hmm.
And a little later on at the end of the chapter, I wanted to get your thoughts, Vanessa, on Douglas at page 100 and 101. I mean, it starts at 99, but 100 and 101. So this is right before they leave the Tico. There's an officer by the name of Dred Douglas. And so he's seen as like a hero, this mythological character, someone who works like 24/7 policing. And he sees this as kind of a virtuous thing, right? Again, kind of the lack of awareness on the part of our narrator here. And to me, what struck me is Douglas is Black himself, and he's terrorizing his own community. Mm-hmm. And there's different passages where he's compared. There's a lot of football metaphors here that struck me. And so, for instance, he's like a football referee who ejected players for improper shoelacing. No infraction escaped his Argus-eyed view. And it's just kind of showing the way that he can take any little thing as a pretext for locking them up. And then even just eye contact, right? Like you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, because at the bottom of 100, it's kind of described as, if you make eye contact, it's suspicious. But so too was the conspicuous avoidance of eye contact, as it's described there by a narrator. Mm-hmm. And on 101, it's mentioned also how he uses a baton, and he was like an over-eager linebacker who blitzes on every down. And for those who don't watch football, that's pretty much like saying that you don't care about the actual play. In other words, you don't care about doing your job as a linebacker. All you care about is getting to the quarterback. But like you're not actually following what the coaches want to do. You're not following what you're just doing it for yourself. In other words, right? You don't care about the game. You don't care about winning. Um, so he just kind of struck me, and you know, I was struck by the way that he is, the way that he has, you know, become essentially an Uncle Tom of a police officer. And it's something I think that unfortunately does happen even today. Um, it reminded me also of Hate You Give, you know, because we kind of see that. I mean, not Hate You Give, Black Klansman, you know, because to some degree it's, you know, it happens a little bit, right, where he kind of goes into like the Black Panther or whatever it is gathering, you know, and so he has to go undercover, you know, and so there's a lot of that tension. I think there has always been that tension that someone who's a Black officer, at least in his own community, is kind of seen as a traitor. But I don't know what you thought about Douglas.
Well, I definitely did make that connection between Black Klansman as well. But here on page 101, I thought it was, I don't even know how to say it, but and I think it's crazy that it was where he says, during the years we lived in the Tico, I personally observed him bodily searching nearly every man, woman, and child at least once. No body was left unturned. And it makes him seem like he's just doing it for like the heck of it almost.
Yeah, I mean, you know, and children too, right? As it says in the line that you quoted, and you know, even senior citizens later on is mentioned.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, he's pretty much a terror, right? And the Hate You Give, there's also what's the name of he's the one of the antagonists from the gang of forget the
want to say King.
King, yes, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, King, right? I mean, it's kind of like King here because he's also terrorizing, you know, that Black community in that story. And he's also Black. But yeah, you know, it's another way that, you know, if you've seen Get Out, it's a character who's in a second place and someone who, you know, doesn't realize what he's doing, right? He's only doing it. I mean, he does realize, but he's only doing it because he thinks that's the right thing to do in the eyes of the white police, right? The white enforcers. So yeah, it's very sad because of that. And you know, it's one way that policing can be extremist in that regard, even from someone who's a person of color. So a little later on, I think you said you had a 120, 121?
No, I have 126.
Oh, okay. Well, I had a 120, and it's a small passage, but I wanted to point it out because I made connections to an invisible man. So he's talking to Jojo here, and you know what he sees here is he ends up getting a doll, and he gives it to Jojo, and so he says it was a representation of the civil rights leader, that former mayor I mentioned, Raquel Sula herself. It was clad in a gray pantsuit and brown bow tie. Of course, the doll's humanity was substituted for something more salable, an adorable monkey. Some people thought the Sula monkeys were racist, but others believed they were a preemptive strike against bigoted minds. If we could transform a rest leader into a marmoset, then what did it matter if certain people wondered if we blacks had tails that we tucked into our underwear? As for me, I found the monkeys cute. I had one when I was in grade school. So I connected this to there's a scene, Vanessa, in Invisible Man, where our invisible man sees one of his former mentors by the name of Brother Clifton, having joined what he called the Brotherhood. Brother Clifton left the Brotherhood because he felt, as someone who was Black, that they were not looking to the interests of the Black community. And Brother Clifton ends up traumatized because of it. And he's Invisible Man sees Brother Clifton selling what are ensemble dolls in the street. Ensemble dolls are another racist dolls that existed, and here it's the same thing that's going on. So I see it as a clear allusion to it, and it's very distressing again that once again our narrator, he just finds it cute, right? He doesn't actually see a problem in how racist that is. And again, kind of showing how our narrator doesn't have that awareness of how this is problematic, right? And I mean, he kind of does frame the two sides, but he ends up siding on the part where it's kind of just inoffensive. It's just a doll to him, pretty much. Mm-hmm. But a little later on, he remembers on 121, Sir, who's his father, who refers to him that way. And his father kind of had this very interesting viewpoint that we'll get to later on. But, his father makes it a point at the bottom there that the oppressed can oppress, boy. That's like blaming the lobster for the temperature of the pot. So I had this one in conjunction because it's just really interesting how the way that he frames that. We always say that, racists are those who are white, against Black. And it's kind of interesting, they do have the term reverse racism, where someone who is a person of color might discriminate against someone who's white. But, the way that Surf frames it, and many other sociologists, by the way, I would say, don't, regard reverse racism as something that is legitimate, because of how there's a lot of power dynamics that need to be taken into account. And Sir kind of represents an interesting way of looking at it. A lobster doesn't, you can't blame the lobster for the temperature of the pot, right? In other words, the material conditions that the Black person has grown up with to blame someone who's white are not his fault. They're the fault of the government. They're the fault of the oppressor. And so when someone who is Black retaliates, against the power structures, like by protesting or what have you, which is very important in Invisible Man, as it is important here in the novel, it's not something that is an equal comparison, right? It's like apples and oranges. But yeah, I just like this passage because of the connection there, and how we kind of get, more of his family's own point of view of race relations between the Black community and the white community. But you said, Vanessa, that you had one a little later on 125?
126.
126?
Yes.
What happens here?
So this is, I made a connection to the Black Klansmen on, I guess, the first full paragraph on the page, mm-hmm. where he's trying to get this group, the BEG, to accept him. Mm-hmm. And he says, if I could convince the group to accept me as one of their own, I would quickly move up the ranks. They would vouch for me when the time came. And so it really reminded me of Black Klansman, because he does the same thing. Mm-hmm. And he's trying to be accepted. And so I'll talk to them on the phone, and he would tell them whatever they wanted to hear in order to be able to have that opportunity to, I guess, move up.
Yeah. And that's a very good comparison. I think it's very true that just like with I forget the name of, well, Detective Stallworth, right? At the time, he wants to be seen like he's on their side, but he's really just
Mm-hmm.
kind of there for gathering intel, right? As this kind of spy, double agent, whatever you want to call it. And it's kind of the same thing here,
Mm-hmm.
because what his speech that he ends up saying, knowing what we know about our narrator, is not something that he believes in. He
Mm-hmm.
says, a little later on, right, that, um, he's writing them up, right? And he says,
Mm-hmm.
they're trying to divide us. Now is the time for us to prove to our fellow citizens the value of self-love. Um, and you mentioned the BEG, Vanessa. Did you want to tell listeners what that group is?
I forgot what it was called.
It it, it was
I know.
the
I forgot what the B stands for.
was it the Black Equality Group or the Blind Equality Group?
Blind Equality Group. Yes.
Yeah. And so he's trying to kind of get in with them, right? So that he's able to gain
Please
their
his
favor.
bosses. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Please his
Yeah.
bosses.
Yeah. And so he's really just, just another, this to me, another connection to the Invisible Man, because he joins the Brotherhood and they end up using him because of his speech, his rhetoric abilities.
Mm.
And so it's kind of the same with our narrator here. He's a good public speaker, it seems, but what he's saying, is really nothing that is of substance, because he doesn't really mean it. So yeah, I thought that was interesting too. I don't know about you, but I had another one a little later on 139. If you
Oh,
had one before that.
yes, I have 135.
Okay. So what was this one?
This is where he's talking about the inequality between white people and Black people.
Mm.
I found it really interesting that they needed that Black people aren't really allowed to vote anymore, and they need an upstanding citizen to vouch for them in order to be able to vote.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they've been disenfranchised, right? And so more ways that this dystopia becomes reality, because it's something that still goes on to this day. It goes back to the days of Jim Crow in the South, where there was a poll tax. They had to do all kinds of things just to be able to vote. And here, it becomes even more blatant, because you need a quote unquote an upstanding citizen, right, to vouch for them. And there's rampant unemployment. Even when they do make money, it's like Black women make 30 cents for every dollar a white man does. And 90% of Black moms are single mothers. And then even like with policing, and how Black males are put behind bars, he says, they used to call bringing every able Black body male to jail for questioning racial profiling. Now it's called excellent police work. So it's even more unabashed. And he even says, did I mention that Blacks in most major cities live in fenced ghettos, just like the Tico? So in other words, that the Tico is in like this unique space that everyone who is Black lives in that kind of world. So it's even more monstrous of world, for Black Americans. Why did you find that interesting?
It just felt like a lot of backtracking. Like, I feel like we've made some progression, and then this story takes place somewhat in the future, and it just seems like it's going backwards.
Yeah.
And he's also looking at it from the perspective of how he wants his son to be seen. He mentions it a little later on the page. He says, what if I can ensure that my boy is not perceived as a black man? What if he is simply a man?
And it's something to think about with him, because it's something that is his white whale, right? That he wants Nigel to be accepted, and in some sense, I mean, he's got his interest in mind. And there's a passage later on where it becomes an argument with Penny, his wife. But still, there's a lot to be said about that. Like, that's complicated, I think, because we talked about this in part one, that you are your identity, right? You are who you are, in the sense that if he's black, it's erasing a lot of who he is. And he can't just whitewash it, literally with some fancy scientific or medical procedure, whatever it is. So it is kind of interesting how he kind of ties it in with that. And then a couple of chapters later, I don't know if you had any on 139, but this is with his grandfather's 99th birthday party. And I just had a passage here where his grandfather tells him something that to me struck me as an allusion to the grandfather from Invisible Man. The grandfather in Invisible Man told the Invisible Man, and these were like his famous last words, that you need to yes him to death, in the sense that, just do what the white man does and they'll leave you alone. Right? Like, you won't get in trouble, like you'll get a job, etc. And so he kind of really takes that advice to heart. And so here it's kind of similar, and it's also different, but he tells him, when I die, tell him a clan man killed your old grandpa. Tell him whatever you want to keep him off your back, right? And so, that of course wasn't true. But make them feel like they owe you something. Shame them to death. It's the only way you make it with them in this world. Believe me, I tried. Self-respect will be your end. So it's really sad and interesting that his grandfather has to tell him this. And I think it's also interesting in terms of how he really does take this to heart, in a sense that, there's a lot here that is passed down. Like, this is a novel about passing down from grandfather to grandson, or sir to son, or father to son, with his own Nigel. And I think it's interesting to kind of think about where what is passed down is lost, where the sins of the fathers are not reconciled. The advice that his grandfather gives him is something to some degree he does listen to, in terms of like, you can't respect yourself. But he also doesn't really listen to it because he doesn't shame the white community. If anything, he very much grovels over them, as we learn later on. I don't know if you remember, Vanessa, but there's a passage later on where he's trying to pass out pamphlets to white people. And like, no one, stops, right? He's ignored, and like, people give him strange looks, etc. But he ends up begging, right? He ends up being on the ground, and like, he thinks like, I have this person, like, he's finally gonna take this pamphlet, gonna do my job. But at the end, he's just kind of left there. That nothing comes of it. But yeah, I just wanted to highlight it because of that. The connection to Invisible Man, and how he's taking from here and from his sir different things, and some sense like taking some resentment because of how he's being raised as well. Did you have any thoughts on the way that his grandfather was he kind of didn't seem to be real happy there in the first place.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that he thinks, well, that by being murdered by a Klansman would be able to get him, would be able to get the narrator like some kind of sympathy.
Yeah.
I find it interesting that was the way that he felt that he could get it.
Yeah. I mean, to basically just saying that, the only way that they're going to accept me for who I am is if I make them feel like they owe me something, right?
Mm-hmm.
When, of course, it shouldn't be that way, right? But the grandfather kind of has that frame of mind where, he has that lasting advice, right? That this is the only way it's going to work in this kind of world. And yeah, it is really sad that, it has to come to that kind of viewpoint in that kind of world. And I think it is especially true of like the dystopian world that he finds himself in. But I think even then, I think it's gotten worse than his grandfather's world. I think if he would say that, I think to me, I don't think people would still feel like they owe him something. I think they might end up blaming his grandfather for something he did for deserving that.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so after the party, on 160, 161, I don't know if you had one before that.
I have one on 145. It's a small one.
Yeah, go for it.
He's talking, so the narrator is having a conversation with Riley, who also previously worked at the firm with him and is now also Nigel's teacher.
Yeah.
But he's also a member of the BEG. He's everywhere. But
yeah.
So he's talking to the narrator about, he's calling him out basically for joining the BEG. And he says, you feel like being here is good resume padding, but you need to step off that right away. BEG is all about unity. You're part of the problem we're trying to fix.
Mm.
And so it's almost like he knows that he's not there for the reason to create unity, but just there because his bosses told him to be there, not really a believer in what they're trying to do.
Yeah.
So I thought that was good that there was a character that called him out on that.
I know, right? Like, yeah, I like those scenes too, where he does get called out. And I think especially with Penny, because it's like you just feel like you wanna shake and slap, our protagonist, right, to make him come to his senses, right? Because it is very frustrating, to read like the way that he is very, like I said, in the second place. So yeah, I think definitely, it's satisfying for him to find out, someone's calling him out, right? Like you said. And my passage kind of relates, on 160 because it's kind of the BEG philosophy that he has described, and so here, going back to Riley, he says, the narrator here says, describing his job, my job was simple: draft position papers that argued for a nation without divisions. Instead of out of many one, BEG thought of America as a big bowl of milk into which tiny drops of chocolate, caramel, dulce de leche, coconut, or tamarind, tamarindo as we call it over here, could be diluted out of existence. Out of many, only one. And I kept inadvertently mentioning multiculturalism, diversity, facts, history. Once I mistakenly inserted the phrase white supremacy. So it's very silly of how the narrator, doesn't know what he's saying, right? He's kind of like going with the flow like a zombie. And, the milk is an interesting analogy, right? Because normally we think of like the, what's it called? The melting pot, right? Where, in America, like everyone can be different. Like you can be Muslim, you can be Christian, you can be Jewish, you can be non-denom, you can be atheist or whatever. But ultimately, we all are American, or we accept America for what it is, or accept that we can criticize it because of free speech. But, here it's milk with like all these things that are thrown in there, right? And the milk, being white, it's interesting kind of thinking of it that way. It also reminds me of Get Out. I know I've been mentioning that, but, there's a scene with milk, a bowl milk and Get Out, or not a bowl, but I should say a glass. But once you see it, you'll make sense of what I mean. But, it's kind of funny how the e pluribus unum of out of many one, which is in coins and such, and our national motto, becomes out of many only one, right? And so it's kind of this idea of like, you got to sacrifice who you are, your individuality, and you got to become normal, right? You got to become white, you got to become Christian and straight, or whatever, the norm in this world, right? Which is a white world that has sucked all these things of the beauty of things, right? Like caramel, chocolate, dulce de leche, right? These are beautiful things. And you're going to dilute it, right? As he says. And he at least recognizes that, I think he's not completely blind to that, even though he belongs to a group that kind of is known for that. And it goes back to the Brotherhood in Invisible Man that has the same philosophy, that they don't talk about race, right? They're colorblind. They just want to talk about economic inequality, not racial inequality. So that's what I connected it to. But I think I just wanted to let the readers know, how our character just keeps basically adopting and subscribing to this message that is totally going to erase the Black community, because it's going to force them to assimilate. And in so doing, if they don't assimilate, they're going to be thrown in jail, or they might even, be victims of genocide. And so as we come to the end of part 2, on 187 and onward, the big scene in this part of the book is a confrontation between him and his wife, Penelope. And so I know you had this one too, Vanessa, so I wanted you kind of take the lead. And what is it that you found interesting about this argument that they have over Penny basically finding his journal, right? Something that we've seen before in a lot of other stories, like someone else finding a journal where they're keeping things from the other person.
Well, it wasn't so much about their conversation that I found interesting. But there's a paragraph towards the bottom of 197. I don't know if we had a paragraph before that.
No, it's the same one as me.
Okay. So I made a connection between the hate you give and this paragraph. And it says, "It was then that I realized the distance between us. The talk that all Black parents give their children was such an integral part of my upbringing. One night when I wanted to play after dark, Sir and Mama sat me down and basically said, the chances of something like that happening to you are virtually assured." Penny was aware of this phenomenon. Many white people were, but her parents never gave her the talk because it wasn't necessary.
Were you thinking of Maverick and Star?
Right, yes. That's exactly what I was thinking of.
Yeah, me too. It's interesting if we look at it from the perspective of the narrator here, because we've gone through this discussion here and shown you listeners how our narrator is in the second place. He doesn't see the Black community as something worth uplifting of its own. He wants them to assimilate, starting with his son. But Penny, who is white, is very much against that. And here he presents his defense, right? So as a lawyer, I imagine him like, this is his defense to, like, even though he doesn't say it, but he just says like, well, we got to do it because he's black and like the police do awful things, right? So he wants, obviously he cares about his son, but it's kind of interesting how he says, what you mentioned, that, well, Penny has the privilege of being white, and that because she's white, she can't imagine a world where she would be killed by a police officer or put in jail because she's white. What do you make of that? And maybe in connection to the hit you give.
Well, it's clear that she doesn't see things in that same perspective, but I like that she's still fighting for her son in the sense that she doesn't want him to have to change, that she's willing to love him just the way he is, and she wants to love him just the way he is, rather than making him change in order to be, I guess, accepted. Or
no, yeah, I think accepted is a good way of looking at it, right? Accepted for who you are, right? What you look like. I think that's just the basis of like the social contract, right? That you accept people for what they believe, what they look like. And of course, our narrator is much more pessimistic, right? Because he, as he mentions, he fears the police doing something to his son, and so he just wants him to not be black because of that. And a little later on, 198 to the end of the chapter, the argument keeps going, right? It's a long argument back and forth. Penny is woke in the sense that she realizes that, it is dangerous out there, but she says, we're not in the Tico, right? And she also says, it's not worth sacrificing his identity for that. And something we haven't mentioned is that our narrator isn't exactly a saint in other ways, because not only what he does in his job is problematic, but he's also addicted to what they call plums, which are basically pills, that give him a high, so he's got like this drug addiction himself. And it reminds me of a Minority Report, because in that film, it's also about surveillance. And our our protagonist in that film is also addicted to some kind of futuristic drug they have in that world, dystopian world. But anyway, so what she decides to do is, she decides, well, I need to take my son, right? I'm going to take him and I'm going to leave you. And they're at the end of 200. What did you make of that scene where, this white police van swerves off? And what did you make of that?
I had such a hard time reading this. I wanted to cry the whole time, especially the way it ends. It's such a cliffhanger, I guess, before you get into part 3.
Yeah.
I was so upset because they don't let him get near her, even though it's his wife.
Yeah, it's so tragic, right? That basically because, she's so upset, she doesn't see this coming. And, the way that she's described, right? I mean, it's very tragic. Penny was suddenly there on the cement, perfectly still and composed, as if some baby on a knoll. And to me, I was kind of surprised too, that she becomes a victim of the police inadvertently. I kind of would expect it more of like Nigel, or like, of course, our narrator, because they're black. So it's kind of an interesting twist, I don't know. And, her removes, it kind of just leaves the reader thinking, well, now he's got full power, right? Because who else is going to stand in his way of what he wants to do with his son? So yeah, I thought it was an interesting twist of expectations, like they've been mentioning the police a lot, Douglas and him, of the danger, but it's ironic that it's Penny who ends up becoming the victim.
And also,
go ahead.
I was going to say how he kind of blames himself because Penny had asked him to call the city, but he never got around to it.
Oh, yeah. Like, it'll be interesting to see in parts 3 and 4, how much of trauma, like we've talked about it today, but how much trauma does he feel? And maybe, does he repent? Does he feel bad, right? For essentially, like, if he wouldn't have had this journal, if he wouldn't have been doing this, on his own son, the Cream, she might still be alive, right? And they might not have had this big fight. So yeah, that's a lot to think about there. Did you have any other thoughts before we close up?
Looking forward to our next episode.
Me too. And so next episode, we're going to finish the novel. So we're going to talk about parts 3 and 4 in conjunction. But if y'all haven't read it, or if are reading it, hope you get to check out some of the other materials that we've mentioned.
Thanks for joining us on this week's episode discussing We Cast a Shadow by Maurice Carlos Ruffin. And if you haven't read it, we hope we inspire you to pick up a copy. Literally Literary is brought to you by the Mellon Foundation for the Humanities Collaborative at EPCC and UTEP. Follow us on Instagram at literallyliterary.ep and on Twitter at literallylitep.